There we go.
Great. I'm pleased to introduce Christine Gelly today. She's the Agriculture and Natural Resources Extension Educator for Noble County and a graduate of Ohio State, where she studied agronomy and natural resource management. And she also has a master's degree from the University of Tennessee, where her study was focused on forage quality and management of warm season grasses. Christine's going to share and have the other members of the team introduce themselves as well. We have several Ohio State educators with us today to talk about forage as vegetative cover for utility scale solar in the Midwest. Christine, we will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Gwen, and thank you for the invitation to present today. We have had this topic pop up in some of our other recent meetings where we alluded to, hey, we're working on this right now and we'd love to share about it. So thank you for the opportunity to share. We have quite a big team working on this, and it continues to grow as we plan to expand our research project moving into the future. But today, James Morris and I are going to go through this slide deck with you to share what we've set up so far and our preliminary results that we can share with you today. And then we'll allude to some of the research that's coming in the future. And after we get through our slide deck, Eric, Brady, and Sarah will also join in to add to discussion and take any questions that the group may have. We do have an evaluation for you today, and that will be an evaluation of James and I's presentation of the slides. So if you would take the time to complete that after we're finished, we'd greatly appreciate it. Before we get fully started, James, I'm going to end with an introduction to you, but start again there with Brady. Brady, would you mind sharing a bit about how your expertise ties into the project we're working on?
Yeah, sure. And thanks for the opportunity to be here again today, Christine. I currently serve as the State Small Ruminant Extension Specialist. And as we think about vegetation management in these utility scale solar systems, it only makes sense that when we think about livestock species that we need to be thinking about how we can incorporate sheep into the puzzle. Sheep are a selective grazer as compared to cattle, which I describe as kind of like a vacuum. They're a bit bigger in terms of size as well. And goats are just simply ornery. They may crawl and climb and want to chew on some other things as they attempt to browse. So the easiest solution in my mind is incorporating sheep into these types of systems. I'm also very interested from the forage quality aspect of this project as well, because we need to ensure that we have adequate feedstuffs for our livestock species all throughout the production cycle.
Thank you, Brady. We're going to touch more on the aspect of grazing within solar towards the end of the presentation, because one of our big focuses here with this project is helping folks understand how large the sites are that are going in Ohio and how many sheep it would actually take to successfully graze that site, and what a challenge it is to try to incorporate the aspect of an operating solar facility and an entire block of sheep that can't just be set loose to roam free the whole time without supervision. So we're incorporating that into our plan of action. But at this point, what really spearheaded this project in the first place was Eric Romick and I were discussing what can we do on this site that is practical and doesn't require a huge amount of re-engineering. And we thought that producing hay on these sites is a possibility if there's enough space between the rows. And that's where this Between the Rows project really got started. Eric, do you want to talk a little bit about the track record of what got us here to this point?
Sure. And as you mentioned, like, this is something that we've been working on this for the better part of 4 or 5 years now, with a number of different developers that have had interest in doing something of this nature. I would say the one point of emphasis as we look at all of this is to kind of keep in mind, we recognize, like, there's hundreds of different options in terms of what you could do for some type of a multi-use approach as it relates to solar and some type of agriculture. Our focus has really been on looking for solutions that could be scalable to the type of development that we're seeing. We talked about the projects at the siting board. I mean, there's over 90,000 acres of potential development that's, under review at the siting board at some level. If you look further up the pipeline at the PJM interconnection queue, there's another 299 projects that are working through the PJM process. You can start to apply some numbers to that. I mean, we could easily be looking at, 280,000 acres or more, several years down the road that could be under development with solar. And so these are projects that are larger in nature, hundreds and hundreds to thousands of acres. And one of the things that we tend to lean on is a solution that is, can be applied. Like we have to come up with solutions that developers are interested in taking and putting to action. And so part of that is going to be the fact that it needs to be scalable to the size of development they're looking at. It needs to be workable in terms of the design modifications. There's a certain limit to how much they can tweak the designs before it just becomes unrealistic. And so looking for solutions that are scalable and economical, I guess, is what we're saying, has kind of led us to this. Not to mention, we think that there's some benefits back to the site as well. So what can we do to maximize not only the economic benefit on the development side, but maximize the impact back to the site as we look at these projects 30, 40, 50 years down the road.
And so speaking of that developer piece and how what we have in mind plays into getting the site started in the first place, we had multiple contacts, multiple sites where we thought we could put our preliminary plan into action, and it took a few tries to get one that was successful. And so thanks to Sarah and her home farm in Savion, we finally got this project on the ground. And that's what you're seeing in my virtual background. Those are the examples you'll see in this slide deck. This is our test plot that's actually on site at Sarah's home farm, installed to spec with a large scale site. And we were able to work within the parameters of this site to gather our preliminary data and move forward to scaling this up on a much larger scale. So we are so thankful for the partnership we have with Savion and with Sarah. And Sarah's actually has moved up into a new position. And please correct me, Sarah, if I get your title wrong, but she's now the Director of Agrovoltaics for Shell. And so Sarah, if you have a chance there to unmute and tell us a bit more about what you do and how it plays into the project, that would be great.
Yeah. Oh gosh. So it's a lot about what, Eric is talking about with the complications that we're seeing on the utility scale solar side is the economics that goes into it, the design that goes into it. No one's done this before. So it's really just it's kind of an idea that we're having to change the way everyone is thinking to get them to think like a farmer, basically. So where Christine's sitting, that's actually, so I'm from Van Wert, Ohio. That's where our farm is at. I'm a Buckeye. I've actually worked with Extension before in my earlier days. I wanted to farm these sites when I started. So meeting, Eric and Christine and being like, hey, we know we can farm it. We know we can do something. How do we convince the suits that it's possible, that something will grow, that it's going to make money, that we can do it in a way, that it's going to be beneficial to everyone involved. And so my job is actually Director of Farming Operations and Agrivoltaics. The reason we put farming operations in there is because you talk to a lot of farmers and you say you do agrivoltaics and they're like, what? That they don't, and that was my husband and my dad, right? They're like, no, why don't you just call it farming, Sarah? Because, we have applied for a grant and they came back to us and said, well, this isn't innovative. And what we're seeing is really the innovation is opening people's minds to thinking that this is something you can do with these projects and make them work and make it feasible, make it economical. And it's not really a heavy lift. It's just somebody being willing to try it. And you're starting to see it with sheep because I don't know if that's easier. People are like, oh, we'll just put sheep on the site and they'll do it. And they're not realizing, hey, the farming is a little bit more intricate. And what Christine does is just mind blowing to me, with the forages and shoot, I do soybeans and corn, right? So I don't have to think about all the crude proteins and stuff that we thought maybe the shade would impact. So my job right now is trying to kind of set up that department and figure out how we're going to work with the farm all the way from the development phase through the permitting, through the, the construction and the 40-year life of the project. So I'm going to probably have people working all through those different phases and contracting with local farmers that have the smaller equipment that can do the work, that live on site. I'll probably have tenant farmers for it. I might be able to farm some of my own stuff. We own some of the ground, we lease some of the ground. So all the legalities, the insurance, everything's coming into play with my job. And then I have to teach all the other industry players and developers how to do it as well. So that's what I'm getting myself into. And I love that I have the Ohio State with me to show all the facts and help the guys understand, help my bosses understand that, hey, this is economical. There is a market for it and it does make sense. So.
Thank you, Sarah. Sarah and I were talking at Farm Science Review about how we're going to be on that commercial that plays during the football games about how the Ohio State University is, making everybody's life better. And we're coming up with these technological advances that are innovative, and we're going to be there. They're going to take that sunshiny shot through our solar site with our forages growing and maybe some sheep grazing. And we think it has the potential to get to that point. And the whole point of it is helping Ohioans. So that's an intro for James to jump in, because James was in Brown County when we started this project, now is in Highland, and has been seeing some of these installs happen in his counties and working with landowners and other stakeholders. So James, tell us a bit about how you got involved, and then go ahead and tell me when you're ready to advance slides.
All right. So you can go ahead and advance, Christine, and I'll do my intro from there, because the team really outlined the great introduction of why we chose to do this project. But first, how I got involved is kind of like Mark. I know Mark had an early project being established in his county there in Hardin County, I believe. And we, Dale mentioned it. We had confusion, chaos, questions, and concerns. When he said that, I'm like, wow, that's, every site where this is put into, you have just both sides of the party there just in complete chaos. We have just unprecedented case of what to do on these sites, and both of the sides were coming to us for help, and it's really hard to provide that help when we don't have the experience ourselves. We base our work through extension off of research, and we don't have that research yet, and this is why this is such a critical project for us to do. And again, we can't thank Sarah enough for giving us the playground to do this on and being our liaison for the industry to be able to do these types of projects. Because we had people such as Sarah coming to us then of what do you recommend to put on these sites, and farmers also asking us what's the best sustainable approach that we can do over this 30-year lifespan. And then the question as to what we all want to know is, how does this transition back into potential farm production at the end of this lease, whether that's 30, 60, or however many years. And the question was, is that possible? And I think that's another question we hope to be able to answer through this. And so that's how I got involved, helping out from the forage side of things, but also having that direct relationship with an established solar site in our county, that the site manager really has been very, very flexible and willing to work with us on our questions as well. So hopefully having that insight on that county level and some forage background there as well. So as we outline the current challenges of this project, the biggest thing, as I mentioned, that we saw was just, pure chaos as to what to do. We saw multiple strategies being utilized, and we're being asked which is the best. And that's where we really developed, as you'll see here in the next couple of slides, we talk about our fact sheet as forage as a vegetative cover for utility scale solar. Because keep in mind, the majority of the developers do not have the agronomic or vegetative background to be able to make informed decisions on how to do this. So this fact sheet serves as dual purpose to address those issues we mentioned were coming in from both sides as to what to plant, how to plant, and to give some guidelines as to the site conditions to take in consideration for forage as a cover. And then on the opposite side, it gives that farmer that flexibility to say what is the best, hopefully, option to be a sustainable and a longevity approach to a transition phase for this site. And that's why we thought, and Christine really, and Eric were thinking that the cool season forages provide that benefit. And I'm going to talk about the benefit as compared to the other options in just a minute. But all of that is what really birthed this project of Between the Rows, because again, we don't want to make those recommendations because this is an unprecedented case in an unprecedented environment where we're growing in different light conditions. We're growing in different moisture. Rainfall is going to look a little bit different in each of these locations. And what does that soil condition take an effect on the seeding rate and the productivity of those forage? And that's what we needed to study, is to get a better understanding of that. And so moving on, we're going to talk about our program objectives, what we hope to learn, go over, Christine's going to talk about our test plot layouts, and then we'll talk about some of the preliminary data that we've pulled from this site over the last few years and what our next steps are to hopefully, as we've been mentioning, scale this up and bring this to a producer style of a project. So those current challenges, I think we've covered this from Dale's talk into ours. But the biggest thing, and as you can see why it's so nice to have such a versatile team, and not to mention we now have Amanda Doritas helping us from the agronomic side along with us, but we have to have specializations in each one of these areas because these are the questions we get brought up. Well, we want to use a pollinator plot because they are, from a developer side, a great environmental benefit, right? It's going to look good for the public. We're doing a service to the community by helping the pollinators, but we have to be realistic in the fact that this has an extremely high establishment and maintenance cost, and the maintenance itself is just a hurdle because of mainly because of weed control. Our weed control options there are very limited of what we can do, and we have to be very aware and have that county knowledge as educators and state specialists to say, hey, we know this area. That farm that's being put on was polluted with a noxious weed, water hemp, palm amaranth. You're going to have issues. That's not going to be a practical and sustainable approach. And Eric mentioned the scalable. Not only do we have to fit the scale of the site for that specific forage species or that specialty crops, that's way too labor intensive. And the scale of these sites, if we're talking 1,500 acres, that's great. We're going to do maybe 2 rows of that in specialty crops, and that's going to be the maximum capacity. In the same way and this is where Sarah's been great to hopefully be that liaison into the industry of how do we adapt these sites to be hay ready friendly without just shooting the cost of developing that site out the roof. So it has to be economical for both sides. And we think this, and I think we can prove that this is a sustainable and economical approach from both sides. And then of course, we already mentioned some of the grazing costs there. And where I think the forage side was really going to prove to be the best benefit as paired to just turf grass. We'll throw turf grass down and mow it with. I've seen 0 turns on the site. I've seen small scale bush hogs where we're wasting energy, where we're not utilizing those resources, and they're paying somebody millions of dollars across the state to utilize that to come in and be able just to provide that service. So this is going to reduce cost on both ends. Go ahead, Kristen. Yeah. So this fact sheet puts all of what we're kind of talking about into a guide for both sides. And I really suggest that if you have producers or site managers who are looking for some suggestions, this is kind of an entry level way for them to begin conversations at that table when they're developing the contract, as Dale mentioned. Once it's in writing and it's not going to change. So this is a conversation and a great fact sheet to give both sides prior to that lease agreement. And where we're seeing hopefully the benefit not only to the cool season pastures, providing back nitrogen to the soil over that 30-year span. As we're utilizing those, we're going to reduce erosion because in our area, erosion and runoff was a very big concern. It's a pretty poorly drained area. So what can we do to soak up that water that's coming down and hold those nutrients in place? And then of course, being able to provide even pollinator benefit from some of our legumes as well. Go ahead, Christine. And as we mentioned, just to kind of maybe paint this picture a little bit better from our Ohio State University Extension team and Sarah's farm here at Rona Farms and their swine facility developed the Between the Rows project that both sides were kind of housed under that Between the Rows project name. And now I'll kind of let Christine talk about specifically the work we're doing as Between the Rows team and where we're going forward.
Thank you, James. At this point, I'm going to jump in and tell you what's going on in the background here. What did we actually do once we had these ideas generated? How do we put it into practice? And so I apologize, I'm going to be looking away to my screen over here and my camera's over here. As we look at our design plan, we were limited on actual space, square footage to work with. We had a lot of questions here. And so to be able to tell which questions were important enough to carry on to a large scale study, we went ahead and we asked all the questions that we had. And the main questions that we had moving into this were what crops can be successful, which forage crops will do well here. Can we recommend the typical planting criteria, or do we need to make changes? Should the seeding rate be adjusted? For example, is one big thing that we looked at. And then we also noticed visual differences between where the sun was primarily hitting and which areas were primarily shady. In our test site, these are fixed panels and not trackers. So we do have consistent sunlight in the same areas hitting each day. So we did have shaded areas and sunny areas. That may change if we look at a tracker system. But because we noticed those distinct differences, we made sure that we also accounted for sun versus shade with each of these parameters. We had 4 rows of modules to work with, which provided us with 3 alleyways and then our control plots, which would be on the outside. So whenever we talk about a control, that would be considered the normal way. There are no variables in place that we put on that site. It would be as if those crops were growing in an open field next to the panels rather than between the rows. So in the top part of the chart here, those are our control plots. And we wound up going with 3 different forages to test here. We started with our cool season hay mix, which in simplistic terms, that's the most common mix that most Ohioans will use for hay and also for pasture in Ohio. It's going to be a combination of things like perennial ryegrass, Kentucky bluegrass. Often we'll have tall fescue in it as well, maybe brome grass. And we think that has the best potential for success because people are familiar with it and because the harvest timing plays well into when we'll be able to get equipment on and off of our site. We also tested alfalfa. Reason being, alfalfa is the queen of forages. It is the most highly valued forage crop that there is. If you're feeding an animal for high production and you have high nutrient needs, you're likely going to be looking at alfalfa as a roughage source for those livestock. So the dairy industry is a huge consumer of alfalfa products, and the horse industry is as well. Whether or not their horses need all the alfalfa they feed is a different topic, but dairy producers are a primary person when we're thinking about target audience for usage. So we know that we're within driving distance of many sizable dairies that are looking for this feed source. Can we grow it here? If we can we imagine the potential both for revenue generation and then also making a difference in that forage gap? It has to be huge. And then also we put in some test plots that were considered cover crops. The idea with these cover crops plots is if we need to buy time, depending on when the site construction is finished and allows us to get in and plant, it may not be the ideal window for planting a perennial crop. And so what we can do with a cover crop is buy time. It can allow us to adjust the site to get fertility on track. It can allow us to prevent soil erosion due to either bare soil in the summer or in the winter. And that can also help reduce weed competition when seeding time does come. And so our plan for this site was to use teff grass followed by crimson clover, which is a winter annual. So tough grass is a summer annual, and crimson clover is typically grown as a winter annual. And that would keep our soil covered from the late spring all the way through to the next spring. Unfortunately, our cover crops didn't do so well in our planting. We actually got a volunteer cover crop that came up afterwards, thanks to Sarah's farm usage of cover crops on their soybean rotation. So then we took each of these and row by row installed our cover crops, our alfalfa, and then our cool season hay mix. And you'll note each one here, we changed the seeding rate. We have a 75% seeding rate, so that means less than normal, what our normal recommendation would be. Then we have 100%, which indicates this is the current recommendation of how much seed to put on per acre. And then we have 125%, so that's an increased seeding rate. The question there is, do we have so much competition that we're losing seedlings that need to be replaced with a higher seeding rate? With the lower seeding rate, the question there is, when plants are growing in shade, they often have greater leaf areas. So they expand their leaf surface to be able to receive more light. So is it beneficial to actually have a lower seeding rate with more leaf tissue in the environment because it's shady? Not sure, let's test it. And so we did. And
Real quick, Christine.
Yeah.
While we're on this slide, actually, if you wanted to go to the next slide, I think it would be even better to address this question.
The next slide looks like this.
There you go. So I'll just jump in real quick to address this question, make a point, and then hand it back over. Mark's asking how we mow the forages under the solar arrays and if there's any metal infrastructure between that could cause issues. And that brings up a couple of points. And so kind of back to the design, one of the challenges that we faced with this is, it goes back to the regulatory discussions we were having earlier, right? It takes, years to get through PJM and the power siting board and into construction. And then you have the 12 to 18 month construction window before you could actually test something on a utility scale site. And so that was part of the challenge is do we want to wait several years or can we find something to get some preliminary data now? And so this site was actually built at Sarah's family farm there, but it was done so kind of following the construction guidelines from a utility scale site. So when you think about the alley width, so the width between the panels, so from kind of the front edge of the glass to the back edge of the other, those alley widths were based on some preliminary designs for one of Sarah's projects. The panel height, the racking, the modules themselves were all, equipment pieces that they were speccing for their project. So we tried to the best of our ability replicate what their site would look like, with the main difference being that this is a fixed tilt system versus a single axis tracker, like Christine noted. So I think that's kind of important to note that we designed this test site to the best we could to replicate what a utility scale site would look like, but allow us to get in early to get some preliminary data on what's the quality, how does it grow, what are these variables that Christine's mentioning. We recognize before you're going to apply this to a 1,000 acre, 2,000 acre, 3,000 acre site, there's going to be some concessions, right? There's going to be, we keep kind of using the phrase hay ready site, right? They'll have to design a site with this in mind. So that gets to your point, Mark, on some of the potential obstructions. So are they trenching DC cable or are they hanging them above ground? That could be certainly an obstruction that would prohibit you from going through the alleys. Certain tracker systems have arms that would get in the way from allowing you to go through there. So the answer to your question is yes, there are some of those infrastructure pieces that could be issues. So moving forward, they would have to amend some of the designs in order to do this. But that gets back to our question on the economics, right? So before we can do a full economic analysis, we really have to understand the quality of the hay that we're producing, and then we can start to look at some of that. So yes and no, there are some issues with potential obstruction, but there is also the ability to design a system that does not have those obstructions in the way as well.
Thanks, Eric. Thank you for watching the chat. If anybody has additional questions as we go ahead and pop them in the chat and we can stop and talk.
Yep, I'll keep an eye on the chat box.
Excellent. So again, pointing out the picture here of our test site. So as I was showing you that chart, making it oriented to this photo where my mouse is. Are you able to see my arrows? I hope.
Yeah, we can see them, Christine.
Okay, so in front of this first set of panels, that's where our control plots would go. And then next would be our cover crops. And then next would be our alfalfa. And then in between the last two is our cool season hay mix. And then as we proceed down the row, we split that up into 75% of the seeding rate being closest to the driveway, then 100% down the middle, and then 125 on the outer edge. Now, you may wonder, Christine, that's not a randomized orientation, and that is true. But part of the issue with engineering a design like this is it has to be practical at the same time. So we have to be able to maneuver through the treatment zones in a way that makes sense. And when we're looking at a site that's this small, if we had alfalfa in a square next to cool season hay in a square, next to cover crop in a square going down the same row, how would we operate the mower? That gets to be a hand clipped section instead of mechanically clipped, which is going to not provide us the information we want. So we actually have a split plot design in this situation. So let's move forward and take a look at some of the results. So we got this all set up after many years of trying to figure out where can we put this and how can we get it into place. We got it, and we actually got some results. So here in the photos, you can see us on planting day. This is Sarah and her husband, Kyle, Eric, myself, and James. We seeded these plots. We actually walked seed on with a hand planter to get the seeding rate correct. And then Kyle went around the outside edge and seeded the exterior part. Then we also cultipack that seed down. Kyle drove across to press the seed into the soil. And then a few months later, we had growth. So we only took one set of samples in 2021, just because it takes time for these plants to establish. So we seeded in late May, and we took our first harvest in September 2021. You can see Kyle going through the plots here to mow off the weed growth. We didn't bale anything off in this first year just because we wanted to remove as much weed seed as possible. You can see in this picture up here with Eric taking a clipping from this plot, these large seed heads, that's a giant foxtail. We did not plant giant foxtail. It moved in as a competitive weed in our cool season hay mix. And because it is a grass, growing in a grass mix, it's very difficult to treat with a herbicide. So our strategy there was try to get as much of it to germinate as possible and then remove that seed so that it doesn't continue to be a problem. To take our samples for both quality and yield, we used this sample square. It's a 2 foot by 2 foot square, which actually converts nicely into meters. If we're going to publish in an academic journal, we need to have metric units. So we go with a 2 by 2 square to clip our samples. And what we would do is at about a 3-inch harvest site, clip off all the material that's within the square. We then dried that material down. We weighed it to figure out what percentage of the sample is water versus dry matter. And then we sent it to a laboratory to be analyzed for quality. So what we can see here on the chart is a summary of our forage nutritive value for alfalfa in 2021. So this is one harvest in the year of establishment. And if we start up here in the first chart, what we see is the percent dry matter value for crude protein as the green bar and total digestible nutrients as the yellow bar. We want high numbers for both of these parameters. The higher, the better. And so we're pretty pleased here with what we see. All of our values are exceeding 20% for crude protein, and our TDN is well above 60 for each of our test plots as well, regardless of the seeding rate. And then if we also look at this parameter, which is RFV, that's relative feed value, this number is generated to try to compare alfalfa to alfalfa. It doesn't work as well for grass crops to grass crops. So when we move on to our next summary that we publish, we'll actually be using relative forage quality instead of relative feed value, because RFQ does a better job at estimating quality of grasses. But what this number tells us, RFV, tells us if we compare this hay to other hays on the market, how does it line up and what's its value? So again, the higher, the better for these numbers. And all of these are really respectable values. If we take a look down here in our parameters, any value above 150 is considered good, and any value above 185 is considered supreme. And then if we take a look down here at weed competition, we did use herbicide treatment in the alfalfa plots, and that definitely made a difference on how much pressure we had in the plots. We did have some weeds, but not nearly the weed competition you'll see in our grass plots. We do see some differences between sunny and shady plots with this. Visually, when we look at the plots, we had much more weed pressure in the sunny zone, but when we dry that down and we actually take a look at grams of desirable forage versus grams of weeds, it wasn't as intense as it looked visually. If we move on to looking at our next set of values, we have our 2022 values. So again, we're looking at crude protein, total digestible nutrients, and relative feed value. Now, some of these values may be slightly lower or slightly higher than the prior year, and that is to be expected because year one was establishment, year two is production. So we were able to take 2 cuts off of the plots in 2022. One occurred on May 20th and the other on August 2nd. And these are the values we saw from each of those. The first one being first cut and the bottom one being second cut. And again, we're seeing excellent values for crude protein in first cutting, as well as TDN and relative feed value. When we move down to the bottom one, this is again typical for forage production. A harvest taken in August tends to have lower crude protein and digestibility. So we see those numbers go down a bit, but still all coming in around good or better. And then there is one section here where you see that it's blank. That just happened to be through the square, and there wasn't anything in the square. So we don't have a value for that section with these charts. Again, on to
Actually, Christine,
RFV. Yes.
I do have those numbers now.
You do? They were missing?
They were missing. I called the lab and they sent them to me.
Excellent.
So I can get those to you for the next report.
Beautiful. And this is the benefit of working in a team as well. So never mind, we don't have a gap there, but we do have a gap in the presentation because this was put together in September. So as we move on, we're going to look at the values in our cool season hay mix. These are drastically different. So this is again 2021 establishment year. And we can attribute all of this quality decline to the intense weed competition that we had. If you notice, we had 4 of our samples that were 100% weeds. And so that made us pretty concerned going into year 2. Are we going to have anything there to sample, or was it all weeds? Unfortunately, we had stuff. It was just a little hard for it to compete with that giant foxtail. So we have pretty low crude protein and very lower digestibility. This actually still isn't too awful bad. When we go over to relative feed quality, again, these are much lower than the alfalfa, but that's typical. A grass crop is going to be lower than an alfalfa crop. We're not comparing alfalfa to cool season hay. We're comparing cool season hay to cool season hay and alfalfa to alfalfa. But that's part of why you see a drastic difference between alfalfa and cool seasons. So our hope moving into 2022 was that we were going to see this weed competition decline and see these quality values increase, which fortunately we did. So again, we did 2 cuttings on these plots. First cutting is on the top, second cutting is on the bottom, and we see significantly better results. Now, I used the word significantly, and I actually cannot do that because we could not statistically analyze these for significance because we didn't have enough replication to do so. So moving into our large scale site where we have enough ground to do replication on each variable that we're testing here, we will be able to statistically analyze them and report if something is significant or not. So technically, I cannot use the word significant. Substantial would be an appropriate word I could use here. Quite a bit of difference. So what we look at here for crude protein, we're now up into 20s for most of these samples, and our digestible nutrients also went up into the 60s for most. Relative feed value here went up quite a bit, 30 to 60 points for some of these. And then on second cut, again, we see a little bit of a decline from first cut to second cut. Again, that has to do with being later in the year. And then also pretty good relative feed value numbers here too. So this is all encouraging as we move forward. The big concern we had with our hay mix, again, was that weed competition. Are we going to have to reseed this site because of all that weed competition? And it turns out no. Once we got that giant foxtail out of the way, what we seeded was able to come up and really fill in the space. So we're very happy with those results. Now, we only were able to take limited samples from the cover crops. And the cover crop that we had sampled here is actually not what we planted. As I mentioned before, Sarah uses winter wheat as a cover crop on her farm. And we had volunteer winter wheat come up in our cover crops. So we used it. We went ahead and we took the values on it because we could at least compare sun to shade in that aspect. So what we saw here with the one harvest we did in mid-May, so that was May 20th as well. Again, respectable values here for a cover crop. This is something you could harvest and feed or graze. Really great digestibility numbers here and pretty good relative feed value as well. But as we move forward, we're going to continue to try to get test information on that teff grass and also crimson clover. But we're happy to have this information about the winter wheat as well. Now, some additional photos to share with you from 2021. You can see here, let me go back. We can see Sarah putting on fertilizer. We did fertilize according to soil tests for each specific area of forage. So if you're familiar with agronomic crops, you're going to have different recommendations for legumes versus grass, even if they're on the same soil. So we had slightly different rates. We may have kept them all the same, but you can have different rates. But Sarah walked those on with a rotating hand spreader. And then what you can see here on the bottom are examples from each of our treatment zones. So we've got our alfalfa, our cover crops, and our cool season grass mix. So there is clover included in that cool season hay mix. And those are really lush and beautiful. That's exactly what we were hoping to see. And next in this set of photos, we see examples from harvest day. So we have mowing, tedding, raking, and baling occurring in the site. You can see the size of the equipment moving through without a problem. We have adequate space from post to equipment. You're able to basically go down 2 passes, get that material raked into the center, and be able to go in and harvest it as small bales. We did use herbicide to try to keep weed free underneath the panels. Go ahead, Eric.
This is also a good image to point out. One of the things that we're really interested in with our second phase of research on a site that would have single axis trackers is, here I think we had roughly 17 feet from the front tip of the glass to the back tip of the row in front. On a single axis tracker, you'd have the ability to run those modules perpendicular to the ground, so that then essentially you're gaining some extra space where you're looking more post to post as your clearance zone. So you'd have less area that you couldn't safely work a mower through.
Yeah, and through conversations with the developers that are already established, access to till, they said they'd be willing, to block off areas throughout the day if that producer needs to get in there during certain times to work, they can change certain areas. They don't have to change the whole site at one time. So they can say, hey, this producer is going to come in, work this 10 acres today. We're going to fix these straight up and down so they've got plenty of room to work. But even at a tilt like that, full tilt, we see across the board anywhere from, as Eric mentioned on this site, 17 feet between for the alley width all the way down to 12, and then up to about 25 to 30. So that's kind of where we're trying to find that recommendation on equipment and turn radius. And even at 12 feet, you can still get enough between the panels on the other rows to have enough turn radius for 15 to 20 feet. Typically not a problem. So it's surprisingly going to be a good fit for that type of stuff.
And a consideration moving forward for for Sarah's development team is, if you want to do this on a large site, thousands and thousands of acres, you might take considerations with your alley width that would also look at the equipment that you're using, so that you're maximizing fuel efficiency. You don't want to do a partial cut, a full cut on the way down, and have a partial cut that you have to come back and clean up, right? You want to try and maximize that surface area that your mower is going to be cutting. So a lot of things to consider moving forward. And initially, again, we knew we were going to have probably more questions from this test pilot than answers, and that's kind of what we're seeing.
One more consideration to remember is that the whole site is not covered in panels. So you've got a lot of buffer areas, you've got a lot of spaces where, I think we're going to be able to entertain a lot bigger equipment or different crops or whatnot because of all of the space that is in these sites. And then we're even talking about farm buffers on the outside of the fence, right? So the idea is, once you're working with the farmers and you have a crop to grow, you can do something with all of the ground. So, I mean, leave it to a farmer, they're going to farm everything they possibly can, right? So that's what we're looking at. It's not just the space between the rows or under the panels that we're going to be able to use for grazing and everything.
So we're going to continue to take data off of those plots as long as we have the capacity to do so. But our next step is to really take this full scale to a larger site. We have a site that we're partnering with Savion on, and it's in Madison County. And on that site, we are hoping to expand our research zone to an area of about 100 acres. And within that, we're going to look at the same questions we looked at here, with the addition of more information on soil health, more information on cover crops, and then incorporating the grazing component as well, using sheep on site. And our hope is that we'll get approval of our grant that we submitted to the Department of Energy. We have not heard yet, but even if we don't get it, we're still going to pursue large scale site. But we're anxiously awaiting the news from that decision. And then we've had questions before about, could you do hay and grazing at the same time, which is what we think may be most interesting on these huge sites. If we have limited numbers of sheep, we're just simply not going to be able to graze the entire site. Can you do both, graze part of it and harvest part of it? And we think absolutely you could, because when we get done harvesting, we have areas that the mower simply couldn't reach. And this would be a perfect area for the sheep to come in, clean up anything else we've missed, and then as a result, we're minimizing our herbicide use. And that also saves us money in the long run. So we could potentially decide the size of the flock necessary to clean up a site based on the amount of quote unquote waste left behind after mechanical harvest. And what this may do is put it in an actual workable scale that we could have a shepherd move in and contract graze. Or if we have a limited number of sheep, they could continuously graze the site, but strip graze it. So have them on for the season, but little bit by little bit move through and clean up the site. So we are excited about the potential here to move forward. We think there's plenty of opportunity for multiple harvest methods to be employed, both by people and by animals. And our biggest takeaway from this is we want to be able to help all aspects of agriculture. We want our farmers who are entering a solar lease to feel like they've done the right thing, made the right decision for what their property can do, and at the same time retain its value as agricultural land moving forward. We also want to help promote the other industries that are involved, the hay industry and the livestock industry, and then help fill those gaps that we know exist in the hay stocks across the country. With challenging weather conditions, we repeatedly have issues with not having enough high quality hay to feed the livestock that need it. And with thousands of acres going into production for solar, we see the opportunity that we can fill that gap with a high quality crop that could come into play here. And with that, we are happy to continue answering questions. Oh, I'm sorry, let me leave that up for a little bit. You could write down our contact info if you'd like. There we go. Do we have any additional questions, or do any of the team members want to unmute and share some things that I left out?
So something that comes to mind, Christine, and anybody else, is if the landowner signed a lease to give the management of that land over to the energy company, then would the energy company be responsible for handling the agronomic hay production and the grazing, or would that have to be contracted out by the energy company, or would the landowner be able to control that?
Well,
I
we have
can take
multiple
that.
people.
Yeah, I can take that one. I would say that that's part of what my job is right now, Mark, is working that out. I think it's going to be a different scenario on every site. We're finding that, some of our landowners live on site and they still farm. Sometimes your landowners live in Florida, right? And they're not there. So for me, every site, we're going to have to identify who the landowner is and how we do it moving forward. I think that when the developer has the initial conversation with the landowner, farmer, those are the conversations that we'll have. So, I'm learning from guys in Southern Ohio. We don't grow, hay like you guys do up there in Van Wert, right? So it's just, there's a whole dynamic to it to unfold and figure out how we are going to partner with each landowner in each project. So it's a great question.
Yeah. Hey guys, building upon what she just said, I'm so glad we've had this presentation and things. I'm on page 5 of notes because I'm telling you this. As you know, in my capacity with the Farm Bureau, I've been involved in a number of cases with the Ohio Power Siting Board, over 100 of them. We now have Dixon Run Solar in Jackson County as part of their plan, wanting to incorporate a sheep production facility between 700 and 800 head on their location in Jackson County. And also building upon what Mark basically has said. Now you know and understand and appreciate the need for you with your legal counsel. If this is an option you want to take a look at as the farmer and as a landowner, you want to have that incorporated into your lease agreement. That kind of detail, those kind of options, because it still is your property and you still have basically a number of responsibilities and options with regard to use of it. It has to be carefully worded in that agreement. I would also say this, and I'm going to be involved in a number of these discussions going forward. There's a number of stipulations and agreements that are between an energy service provider and parties of record on a number of issues having to do with certification and permitting of a project going forward. This is going to be one of the major discussions because you have basically companies who want to do this type of strategy or want to do some sort of livestock production. There's been a couple basically who've brought it forward. Dixon Run has. And I tell you this, it's interesting, is that the need during stipulated discussions, if you're a party of record. And as a matter of fact, our legal team is prepping for this right now, okay? This is what you want to do. This is what needs to be done. Here are the steps, procedures, and things that are going to be part of your stipulation and part of your order going forward. If you are citing this as part of your effective vegetative management plan, here are the things that you are going to have to incorporate to make it so, no questions asked, which means the research that you're doing, the work that you're doing, the collaborative effort are all going to be, don't be a bit surprised if your ears start burning here in a few weeks with regard to, you're going to be working closely with these researchers and these folks to incorporate these practices going forward. We do have some issues and concerns for a couple of these companies. The focus basically is this. This is what we want to do. But when you take a look at the piece of ground they're at, no water, no paddock, no shelter, no home for a herdsman. How do you accommodate 700 head of sheep in that region when you don't have that kind of a population? All those things need to be basically an effective stipulation agreement, and that's part of the hearing process with the Power Siting Board and permitting. So welcome to my world. That's what I take care of, and I really appreciate the wording and stuff that you had here, because your stuff is going to be incorporated into a lot of discussions going forward. Thank you.
That's a good point, Dale. I talked with a sheep producer here in Hardin County. He said if he was younger, he would love to take on this opportunity to graze sheep in these projects. It makes a lot of sense, I think, to graze sheep in there, but we just don't have the number of sheep and the producers in our county to handle the acreage.
Yeah, and I tell you, Mark, it's interesting because you guys all know and love Roger High. Roger basically, who was with Extension for a number of years and also had a dual position with the Ohio Farm Bureau, still works with us. My office is next to him. We wrote basically, I wouldn't call it a white paper, but here's a guide of things that you want to take a look at in the lease agreement. If you want to do animal husbandry, or that's going to become part of the plan, here's some things you need to seriously have incorporated in that lease to make it so. We've also gotten a number of calls and things from folks when we're taking a look at stipulations and agreements on orders and things going forward with the Power Siting Board. Well, if they really want to do this, what needs to be incorporated in that stipulation, in that permit, in that order to make sure it's done properly? And we're working on those things right now. But yeah, Mark, very valid point. You're finding out, again, having a good attorney who understands those issues, your ability to negotiate those in the lease agreement, and also having to similarly do the negotiations as part of a stipulated agreement in Ohio Power Siting Board proceeding are becoming incredibly huge to do this.
Well, Dale, one of the things that I'm seeing is that, working with Shell in Europe, they're doing this, right? They're requiring agrivoltaics. They don't know how to do it yet. They're confused and they're like, show us or teach us, how to farm kind of thing. But they don't know how they're doing the legislation. They're not going to know how to mandate it. I think we have to be very careful because it isn't a one size fits all. It is going to be dependent on where we're at, where, even in the state of Ohio, there's differences. And like you said, not every place is set up for sheep. But the other part of it is you're seeing an industry develop around it. So there's, sheep herders coming together and forming co-ops in Italy. And those are the guys that then you sign up with that have the 700 sheep that come in, and so there's a whole agribusiness industry behind this. Every farmer's got a side hustle, right? And they're all going to start saying, hey, I want to be part of, how do we do solar chickens? How do we do this, right? And it's just all going to come in to play. It's pretty exciting, actually.
Yeah. Well,
So,
Susan,
Sarah, I got a question for you. Just kind of being on the solar industry side of this. So is the idea that the farmer would run their equipment, let's say for haymaking around the panels that you guys own?
It's going to depend. So if the farmer doesn't have the equipment for it, no, right? We're gonna have to figure out if it, like I said, a co-op or somebody, I see someone coming, I've had several people reach out to me, even at Farm Science Review, that are already starting to do this. They're buying the 15-foot drills, the 15-foot hay binds, right? To come through and do it. And they want to travel around and do it at different sites. But then I've also got my landowners who say, hey, you know, I've got equipment that I can do it with. So each situation is different. And that's where what Dale's saying, if you're going to sign a lease with somebody and you're thinking you want to do it, put it in the lease, right? So that they can't contract someone else to come in and do it.
And
So then I guess my question is with liability then, you know, is it something that the farmer's gonna have to be very careful, like signing something that assume liability for damages if that were to happen?
That will come into play. So the part I'm working on with Shell and Savion about that is Between the Rows is going to actually be, it's an LLC of Savion, right? So we can actually contract, it's like a subcontract on building a house, right? You have all your subs, right? And your farmer becomes your sub. So they're going to have a certain amount of liability for that, but there's going to, I mean, we don't want to have 100 people on the site, right? So there's going to be your one or two guys that you're trusting to let in. And we're working out those liabilities. You know, what if they hit a panel? How much is that going to cost? And that's been a big reason why they haven't done it yet. That's the reason why nobody wants to touch this, because they're so afraid of things they don't know. But there's answers to it. We have guys out there mowing. Why can't we have guys out there baling?
That's a good
Susan
point.
brings a very valid point. As a matter of fact, Susan, how much did I say I was going to pay you to bring that up? But no, you're correct. And like you say, each one of these projects is a separate project unto itself, separate negotiations, separate stipulations, separate orders going forward. That permit meets and fits basically the need. And you're correct. Legalistically and logistically, this is going to be huge. One thing that's interesting is this. There's a number of folks in New York State. There's an organization basically doing this, but the largest solar array they're working with in New York basically is about 45 acres. I had farmers basically, and I had some companies soliciting farmers to do sheep production underneath their arrays and different things in Southwestern Ohio. And had several farmers call, and I had some very nice heartfelt conferences with them. And I said to them, I said, do you understand this company has a 1,500 acre area and they want you to have enough sheep to manage all of that simultaneously. And what are you going to do with regard to transport? What are you going to do with regard to shelter? What are you going to do with regard to a herdsman? What are you going to do with regard to watering? All those particular things. Do you understand? And the company sent them a contract, and was fascinating basically to read through that initial contract. And I'm going, guys, you are going to be assuming an incredible amount of risk here based on what they want to do. And you need to go back and discuss this, because the scale and different things, and you've related here, Christine, as in some areas it's small scale. If we were in the Carolinas or we were in New York and New England, this would fit right now. But when you're taking a look at a project, which is now basically several hundred to a couple of thousand acres, ramping it up to fit that economy of scale is going to be incredibly huge. And
Yes.
yeah, and making sure, you know, this is where I'm at, because, you know, I'm not an agronomist and things. I'm in public policy. I'm sitting with companies right now who want to do this, and I'm going, okay, that's great, but you're going to do this, and it's not going to be for public relations. If you're going to do it, you are going to do it right. And here are the things that are going to be in your stipulation going forward to make sure it's done right. You understand that.
Right, because what looks
Yep.
real bad for public policy is dead sheep
And several
laying
of
in the middle
them,
of the field.
yeah, several of them. And I have to say, Savion is one of them, understand that and understand the ramifications extremely well, because the need basically is there. Another thing that we haven't talked about here, if we're talking about carbon sequestration and different things, and you're doing alfalfa and stuff long-term, that's absolutely positively huge also. Carbon credits and that's another income stream for those farmers. the need to incorporate these into lease agreements, the need to
Yes.
incorporate these into stipulated agreements, dictating the order on each individual project is going to be huge. And I say, welcome basically to my world. And I'm so glad that you guys did this, because I'm starting these discussions with 2 or 3 companies right now. So great.
We have been swamped, I'd say, for the last 2 years, probably, with let's meet and have a Zoom and discuss this. Let's meet and have a Zoom and discuss this. We'd like to graze this 1,000 acre site. And we're like, well, let's have a Zoom and discuss this, because how many sheep do you have now? And sometimes they say, oh, well, I have 30, but I'd like to get to 200. And we're like, you need 5 times that to be able
Yeah.
to manage this site. 5 times what you want to get to. Where are you going to get them from? Well, we can breed the sheep there. We could build the flock. Okay.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, well, Mark brings
The
a
one
very
thing
valid.
that
Go ahead, Eric.
the one thing I think is important to keep in mind as we look at our preliminary results here, this is going to bring up you know, a list as long as your arm of things that we need to include in the lease agreement to do this, both, you know, for safeguards on the developer side and for safeguards on the landowner side. How that structure is ultimately going to be set up is going to vary from project to project. But again, in my opinion, we're looking down the road. There's a lot of developers that are really interested in the idea of this. I think they love the idea of you know, positive press and putting it in their power siting board application that, oh, we're going to go do all this stuff, but they never really get into the weeds to see what is it going to take to do it. There's a handful of companies that are willing to do that, and obviously Sarah is working for one of them that we've had the benefit of partnering with. But you know, not to put numbers to it, but there are significant concessions on the design side. They're spending more. You're gonna spend more money up front to design a site that you could hay long term, and that you can use complementary grazing long term. But you have to build it as part of your business model and part of your long-term vision. That's where, again, there's a handful of companies that I think are taking a hard look at this and trying to get the data to see, does it make sense or not? There's others that I think just maybe want to check a box and say, oh, well, we're going to do agrivoltaics. And they kind of leave it at that. And that's not going to work. There's too many challenges that you have to really investigate and again, have buy-in at you know, company-wide that, yeah, this is something we want to consider.
Eric brings a very valid point, and I've had those discussions with some of these companies, and I'm going, great, you're serious, this is what we need to do. Oh, you're doing this basically for an advertisement? That's not going to, I can see 3 administrative law judges asking very pressing questions during your judicial review very, very quickly. But yeah, but I would also say this, and building what Mark basically asked, you know, we're talking here too. Here's a couple other things you're going to need to think about that need to be part of this process, is that taxing with regard to this. Many of these guys pay basically a utility tax on infrastructure. Now you have ground that's still basically being agriculturally done, which applies, or where do they apply? Where does the pilot payment and the tax for the infrastructure for the power generation come in? And then the CAUV eligibility still apply? That has to be looked at seriously, because that has never been attempted or looked at basically in the current law. And again, having farmers in their lease agreement with those scenarios in place is one thing that needs to be there basically to help address that. You are also seeing this, and we're going to have some discussions with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and the North American Electric Liability Council, FERC and NERC, as well as PJM. They are saying this, and this is what says in the law on the federal level. The minute basically solar generation is there or they start construction, this is a power generation facility. You are going to be following our prerequisite requirements and guidelines for construction, operation, safety going forward. You're doing what between the rows? We've never attempted that, which means they're going to have to be brought into this discussion too.
yeah, excellent points. We can talk for hours and hours, but we've already been talking for an hour and almost 15 minutes. So we do know that there's additional business to get done in this meeting today. But we're so excited about where we're going with this, where we've came from, what we've gotten done so far, and what we can see is going to be happening in the future. And just boots on the ground approach. We want to be able to give those people answers when they walk in and they say, "What's a recommended stocking rate if I want to put sheep on this site?" And we can say, based on these parameters, here's what we think. But right now, there's too many variables for us to give them an answer. We can only say, well, if it was just normal open field, here's what we think it might be, because all of it's subjective anyway. But we want to be able to at least give them a tool that they can walk out the door with and feel like they've got something helpful from extension. And we want to make sure whatever that advice is that it's based on legitimate science that we've done here at the university. So we're confident with our team that we've built and our team moving forward, which continues to grow, that we're getting there, and that we have the buy-in both from industry as well as from the university to get there to make a real difference, because we know it's going to be huge. I don't think Ohio knows how huge it's going to be, 10 years from now, but we're hopefully going to have something in place by the time they realize how big of a deal it is. We do want to remind you that we put the link to the evaluation in the chat. So if, as long as you weren't as presenter today, so even our counterparts, Brady, Sarah, and Eric, if you wouldn't mind completing that evaluation for us, we'd greatly appreciate it. That helps the university evaluate our ability to teach the general public. So we'd appreciate you taking a few minutes to do that for us.
Okay.
Thank you all.
Christine, and thank you, everybody.
Dan, just a reminder too, there is a fact sheet that Christine put the link